Welcome to What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Shockwaves are rippling across the country this week after the Alabama Supreme Court decision last week decided frozen embryos are legally considered children. That decision has effectively shut down in vitro fertilization in Alabama and thrown the future of IVF into question across the country. After a week of outrage, lawmakers are taking action. Reporting on this story from Nexstar Nation's CBS 42 in Birmingham is reporter Maddie Beer-Temple.
HB 225 says that a fertilized embryo outside a uterus is not an unborn child. Bill sponsors say that language should protect IVF. The AL Supreme Court decision leaned on an Alabama constitutional amendment that protects the rights of the unborn, leaving some question as to whether a bill is enough to address this or if a constitutional amendment is needed. Daniel says he's spoken privately with clinics who say they would likely resume treatments if a law were passed. He says lawmakers should pass a bill to prioritize helping families now and look to a CA for a longer-term fix.
For those families right now that are going through that treatment, they can't wait until November to a constitutional amendment pass or fail. And so they can't bet on those odds are not good for them. And so I think that from a statutory standpoint, if we address the issue right now with this legislation, it'll get us to the point I think that IVF clinics will feel more comfortable operating than not.
Reporting in Montgomery, Maddie Beer-Temple, CBS 42 News.
While the ruling is still limited to Alabama, some experts say they're concerned about what it means for people everywhere who are trying to get pregnant through IVF. Two women affected by this ruling spoke out at a roundtable with Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra earlier this week.
It is terrifying to think right now that I feel like my embryos are locked up. We're not allowed to move them. We're not allowed to transport them. I wish that every embryo meant a living baby, but I'm here today to say that every embryo is the chance of a living baby, and this recent ruling is taking away that chance for all of us.
And I just cannot live under the false belief anymore that in this country, and certainly not in Alabama right now, that I have the freedom to make choices about my body, my reproductive health, my future that are right for me. Because that's not an option.
Joining us now from Nexstar Nation's CBS 42 in Birmingham is news anchor and reporter David Lamb. David, thank you so much for being here. You know, this ruling sent shockwaves through the nation and around the world. You're on the ground in Alabama. What has the immediate reaction been like there?
It sent shockwaves here as well, and those continue to reverberate. The state's largest hospital, UAB, University of Alabama at Birmingham, called UAB, paused treatments pretty much immediately. Republican Attorney General Steve Marshall, he very quickly released a statement saying that he had no intention to prosecute either physicians or patients these IVF treatments. And there's a huge rally actually on the steps of the State House today protesting the ruling. At that rally, a couple of hundred individuals gathered there. Not only you heard from physicians, you heard from patients, but also leaders in the legislature. And again, keep in mind, Alabama is a very Republican state. So this is one issue that's bringing Republicans and Democrats together. And you actually heard from Republicans there at the State House today, just letting folks know that they are doing everything they can to remedy this situation and take some of this pressure and the concerns, alleviate those concerns.
So, David, what's the latest with that legislation Republicans are talking about, along with Democrats, obviously, to protect IVF?
Right. Several bills are at work even as we speak. They are meeting right now. The Senate Health Care Committee hearing legislation like right now as we speak. Democrats and Republicans are seeking clarity. And one bill actually specifically seeks to shield physicians as well as patients from any sort of legal liability. So like I said, this is a partisan issue. Oftentimes there are partisan issues and Democrats in one corner in Alabama, Republicans in the other. But this is one issue where both Democrats and Republicans are working together. And it is interesting the way even Republicans quickly took the lead on this. And just to let everyone know, they commented almost immediately, less than a day after this ruling came down, saying that we are working to remedy this and return things back to normal.
Washington is certainly paying attention to this issue as well. In fact, Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra held a roundtable during his visit to Birmingham this week. Let's take a look at what happened.
We're trying to figure out at the federal level what we can continue to do to try to be supportive of people who want to access their health care rights. Roe would not have permitted this to occur. But the moment we broke that constitutional right to access for that care, the states were left to do as they wish.
So, David, what was the reaction to Becerra's visit to Alabama?
It actually was pretty much universal appreciation. Patients and physicians appreciated the secretary shining the light on this issue. And, you know, it is rare that you get someone from an administration in your own backyard. So getting a national leader here in Birmingham, on the ground in Alabama, to hear directly from those impacted was incredibly great deal appreciated. But also they really took the most of that opportunity, tried to make the most of it. That rare opportunity to speak to someone from the sitting administration, the Biden administration at this, in this case, and let them know how they were feeling about this, because it was, as you all showed there, it was physicians as well as patients all involved, those that are the most impacted by the issue.
And you touched on this earlier, but at least 3 IVF clinics in the state are pausing treatment, including the largest hospital in the state. Are there any updates on how long this pause will last?
Well, whenever this ruling came down, Hannah Eckel, she's a spokesperson for UAB, the hospital, the largest hospital here in the state, and they sent out that statement that they were pausing those. I reached out to her once again today, this morning actually, and she reminded us that they must follow the decision. So unless the court reconsiders or the legislature passes legislation, their hands are really tied. They are waiting to hear what is going to happen. But at this point, they feel as though they have no other recourse. They have to wait until either the Supreme Court weighs in once again or the legislature does so.
Are Alabama women who were, essentially seeking treatment before this ruling heading to other states outside of Alabama to receive IVF services?
Yeah, we have spoken to several of those candidates that are considering such a move, but keep in mind, this is a very costly procedure, a costly endeavor. So the cost of not only the procedure, but then you add on the cost and the hassle, that is getting in the way and preventing folks. I also think many folks that are kind of in the middle of that such treatment or even considering it, they are heartened by what they are hearing, the reaction, and there does seem to be this immediacy that something is in the works sooner rather than later. And also, one other note, UAB is working on that solution as well. So, folks, if this continues just to linger on and they do need to go out of state, UAB, the hospital here in Birmingham, is trying to come up with the plan to help them if that is what needs to take place.
So you mentioned that there are Republicans in Alabama who are, seemingly willing to work with Democrats to push back on this to protect IVF. Would you say that's a universal feeling among Alabama Republicans, or are there still some Republicans in the state that would agree with the Chief Justice on this?
I sure have not heard from a single Republican that agreed with Chief Justice Tom Parker's assessment and ruling and his outspokenness on this matter. Former President Trump, who is incredibly popular here, he made a statement. He says he wants to make it easier to have babies, not harder. He called on the Supreme Court to reverse course. Alabama Governor Kay Ivey, also a Republican, says she expects the bill soon to correct that situation and looks forward to that getting to her desk where she will certainly sign it. So Republicans on this matter quite outspoken, and again, immediately coming out and just letting folks know that they don't agree either with this, and they're working to provide a solution.
Very interesting situation where we see Republicans and Democrats coming together on, a reproductive rights issue, essentially.
Right.
I didn't think I'd ever see this covering politics. David Lamb, thank you so much for your expertise from Alabama.
Thanks so much for the time.
The controversial ruling by Alabama's top court not only opened the door for legal action against those who discard frozen embryos, but it's also paved the way for the fight at the legislative level, with both Democrats and Republicans calling to protect IVF. Joining us now to break it all down are Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law, Courtney Jocelyn, and Dr. Lauren Wright, political scientist at Princeton University. Ladies, thank you so much for both being here. Courtney, Courtney, I want to start with you first. Alabama's Attorney General Steve Marshall has said he will not prosecute families using IVF and IVF providers. Yet IVF in the state has essentially come to a halt due to fears of legal backlash. Is the Attorney General sending a message to other prosecutors in the state by saying he will not prosecute?
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for engaging with these questions that are so important to so many families in Alabama and around the country. In terms of your question, the AG's statement that he won't prosecute families using IVF or IVF providers is likely not to assuage people's very real concerns on the ground. First, of course, the Attorney General is not bound by his statement. He could change his mind tomorrow and could criminally prosecute IVF users and providers. And more fundamentally, potential criminal liability is only part of the concerns that families and providers in Alabama have today. Prospective parents and providers are also worried about civil liability, which is, of course, what that case was actually about. And again, what the Alabama Supreme Court held in the case is that parties can be liable for punitive damages in civil wrongful death actions for the destruction of embryos, something that is part of standard practice IVF treatment. And indeed, as you suggested, on the ground, what we have seen within a matter of days after the opinion is that at least 3 of the 5 IVF clinics in the state announced a pause in treatment.
And Lauren, I want to get to the political side of this. Republicans have struggled to message on abortion, but have lost on the issue in the past, 2 election cycles. Does this decision present a problem for them going into 2024?
It does. And I think we can see that, as Courtney described, with the on-the-ground reality of the political discussion going back and forth on the Hill and elsewhere this week. You know, even if former President Trump says he supports IVF, which is actually a boon to Republicans, I don't know how they would get through the next election cycle if the head of the party, in effect, the likely nominee, had something different to say about that. Nikki Haley's position that embryos are babies is much more difficult to defend. But despite that, as long as Democrats politically wisely probably continue to bring this up as a campaign issue and make each and every candidate running up and down the ballot on 2024 answer this very relevant question, it is a hurdle, and it will affect every House race in every highly specific district. And especially in those places where, you know, the member might not be eventually voting on abortion legislation or about fertility legislation, people still care about these things because it's part of how they decide, especially in a Republican primary, which candidate they choose.
And Courtney, one of the things that Democrats and critics of this decision have been quoting is Alabama's Chief Justice, who was quoted in the decision saying, quote, "Human life cannot be wrongfully destroyed without incurring the wrath of a holy God who views the destruction of his image as an affront to himself," unquote. Does that go against this idea of the separation of church and state that's really so important in this country?
Yeah. And just to do a little bit of stage setting here, right? So by a 7-2 vote, the Alabama Supreme Court held that frozen embryos are children for purposes of the state wrongful death statute. And in the main opinion, Justice Mitchell decided the case on statutory interpretation grounds. But as you indicate in your question, the Chief Justice Parker, wrote a separate concurring opinion, and that concurring opinion offers a religiously grounded rationale for reaching that conclusion. So he writes, for example, that when the voters of Alabama adopted the constitutional sanctity for unborn life provision in 2018, they adopted a theologically based view of the sanctity of life. And as your quote indicated, he uses a lot of religious language in the opinion. He references God more than 40 times, and doing so in a judicial opinion is extremely unusual. By rooting the decision in a theological view, one may argue that it impermissibly violates the First Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits government establishment of religion.
Right. And Lauren, I want to go back to you. Last week, former President Trump said he supports IVF. Does he risk alienating portions of his anti-abortion base by saying he supports IVF? And will Republicans down the ballot take a cue from him on his messaging?
I don't think so, because first of all, just to start with the polling, even Republicans, even conservative Republicans, are very mixed on this. And their opinion on abortion doesn't always gel with their opinion on IVF or embryos. And so about half of Republicans, 50%, believe embryos are children and should be treated this way under law. The other half don't. There's a lot of mixed opinion on these things. The other half of it is Trump specific. And I've written a lot about this. I wrote a book about how Trump's celebrity status really helped propel him to a win in 2016. And part of that is because he is simply held to much different standards than traditional politicians are. And so while a traditional politician that's running as a Republican might have to adhere much more closely to the party's religious values, Trump gets to say, I'm a business guy, I'm not a politician, I'm not the same as these other people. And he has extreme ideological flexibility. And so last week when I was talking to Leland Vittert about this on News Nation, I was saying if anyone could come out in support of IVF as a Republican and not face any consequences whatsoever, it's former President Trump, because the base loves him no matter what he says, and he has much more flexibility on policy than any other Republican candidate I've seen in recent years.
But still, we're seeing Democrats wanting to go on the offense on this. We saw Senator Elizabeth Warren say last week that IVF will be, quote, on the ballot in 2024. Lauren, do you think she's right?
I do. And, again, I think it's smart for Democrats to bring that up. It might fall flat in a setting like a debate stage, which I don't even think we're going to get to see, where Trump just says, well, I said that wasn't true. That's not how I see it. And then Democrats have to do this work of saying, well, think about the Supreme Court, imagine your other legislators, imagine the other impacts. But it is, in effect, harder when the former president, the likely nominee, has staked out a pretty clear stance on this in support of fertility treatments like IVF, despite, what the rest of his record is. And he's, of course, largely responsible for the very conservative Supreme Court that we currently have.
Courtney, finally, do you see this decision ultimately being appealed to federal courts?
No, I don't. I'm not involved. I'm not representing anyone here. I don't know whether there will be an attempt to seek further review in the Supreme Court. But I do think what is clear is that this decision, whether or not it is appealed, will have ripple effects not only within the state of Alabama, but beyond its borders. Within the state, there are issues that are not yet resolved, whether, for example, there could be criminal liability for the destruction of embryos. Beyond the borders of the state, while this decision is not directly binding on the courts of any other state because it's a decision of a state Supreme Court interpreting a state statute, I think what we are going to see is that this decision will serve as an invitation, really, to courts in other states to follow in this court's footsteps and to embrace the notion of fetal personhood. And I think it certainly puts wind in the sails of those who have been making this argument for many years. There are some states where I think the groundwork really has been laid, states that have statutes that are similar to the constitutional provision in Alabama. Many other states are considering fetal personhood provisions. And if this argument is more broadly embraced, I think what we will see is that other Supreme Court decisions, including the decision in Griswold, protecting access to and the right to use contraception, will be placed at risk. So again, I think what the thing that we can safely say is that this is not the end, it is the beginning, and we will see this argument being made and likely being embraced in more courts around the country.
Certainly the beginning to a big legal and political fight. Lauren Wright and Courtney Jocelyn, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me.
Up against all odds, presidential hopeful Nikki Haley went full force into Michigan.
I will continue to take the cuts and the bruises and the pain and the insults. All I ask is that you stand with me as I do it, and that you be just as loud, not just in Michigan, but after Michigan, and take that voice all the way to the Super Tuesday states because it matters.
But it wasn't enough to make a dent. Trump swept the state with a dominating 68% of the vote. Now, with 5 primaries down and 0 wins for Haley, what does this mean for her presidential ambitions? It's time to go on the record with Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, thanks for joining us. To start, more than 13% of Democrats voted uncommitted in the state's Democratic primary. While President Biden won handedly, what do the results, particularly in college towns and predominantly Muslim communities, say about a general election in the battleground state?
So 2 things. One is 13% statewide is a little bit higher than average. Usually when we see uncommitted races or uncommitted chosen in these races, we see it in the 5 to 10. So 13 certainly higher. What I was looking at was Macomb County and Wayne County, which are the counties that are around Detroit. And Wayne County, where there is a large Muslim population, uncommitted got 26%, so double the statewide average. Macomb County, just north of Detroit, got 18%. And so while that was, we're talking tens of thousands of votes, not hundreds of thousands of votes there, that shows you that that movement certainly has a little bit of a foothold in the key Wayne County. If Joe Biden wins Michigan this fall, it will be because he's got high margins in Wayne County. So this is something for him to keep an eye on.
So Republicans obviously had a primary there last night as well. Nikki Haley picked up 2 delegates and garnered more than 25% of the vote. Trump won big as expected. But what do the results tell us about Trump's ceiling for support and the impact it will have on the general election?
So, as you pointed out, we're 5 races in. It's starting to get a little bit of a sample size. And it appears that his ceiling's probably around the 70 to 85%. And we're going to get a pretty big sample here in less than a week when we do Super Tuesday. But he seems to be consistently being able to get 70 to 85% of the vote. Nikki Haley seems to be able to pull, at least strip away 15 to 25% of the vote. The chatter's been she's been overperforming her poll average. And Donald Trump has been underperforming, but let's put that in perspective. Donald Trump is not in danger of losing any delegates going into Super Tuesday. So while, Nikki Haley's garnering some votes, she's not getting the delegates she needs to actually win.
So we have several states up next in Super Tuesday, which is just a few days away. Which states and counties are you watching most closely?
So in terms of Nikki Haley's chances, I'm looking at Virginia and North Carolina. The way the GOP electorate or the primary rules work, there's a lot of these states that are winner take all. So if a candidate gets above 50%, which Donald Trump has been doing, they just automatically get all the delegates. But a state like North Carolina, if Nikki Haley gets at least 25%, and Donald Trump could still get north of 50, she will get a few delegates. And so 25% is right within the range of what she could get. And so there's an opportunity for her to get some delegates there. Virginia, Donald Trump would have to be under 50%, and she'd have to get above 15, which seems a little bit out of reach. But it'll be interesting. We're going to look at some counties in there, Loudoun. We're going to look at Fairfax, Arlington. Those are the counties that propelled Governor Glenn Youngkin to the win. And he's often considered, a little bit more of a moderate MAGA. And, if it carried him to the governor's office, maybe it gives Nikki Haley an argument to at least carve off a slice of the Republican electorate for herself.
Back to President Biden, a new Gallup poll shows his approval rating is slipping again, now down 3 points to 38%. Immigration and his handling of the Middle East are really hammering his rating. Coming into an election, how important are these numbers?
So right now, they're not important. If we're talking about these numbers in October, it's dire, at least for Joe Biden. And it's not necessarily over because, as most people will point out, as I just said, that they'll be like, well, those aren't votes. Those are just approval ratings. And that's true. Those aren't votes. They're just polls. But what those are indicators, inferences of how voters are going to vote. And so here we are in February. There's a long way to go. Biden, President Biden's got tens of millions of dollars. He's going to campaign. So we've got time to turn those around. But if we're looking at those types of numbers in October, that isn't good because there hasn't been a president that has had that type of lopsided approval rating win the presidency, much less incumbent president re-win the presidency like that. And so if Biden were to do it, he'd be defying the odds.
So RFK Jr.'s momentum seems to have died out. A few weeks ago, we were talking about that Super Bowl ad, but we're not hearing as much now. But in which states could he do the most damage to Trump or Biden?
So it's interesting. I'm glad you brought this up. This was a not very noticeable news thing this morning, but his super PAC, which can't coordinate with his campaign, announced this morning that they have enough signatures to get on the ballot in Georgia and Arizona, which means he's going to be on the ballot and he can actually get votes. What this tells us is that he may not get in all 50 states, but he's able to get on the ballot. He's got enough money and organization to get on some of these states that are going to matter electorally. Georgia and Arizona are going to be battleground states this fall. And guess what? Pennsylvania and Michigan, also battleground states. Those signature numbers are not too much farther than Georgia and Arizona, and he's done it once there. I think we're going to see RFK play a role simply because he's going to get on the ballot in some of these states. So while it's been quiet for him, he's been doing the groundwork that a lot of people have been questioning whether he's going to do, and he's actually doing it.
Yeah, and it seems to be paying off. Moving to former President Trump, his VP shortlist has been floating around with the former president confirming several names as all solid. What considerations should Trump be making in terms of his running mate, and how might it help boost his support?
So there's the considerations that us pundits and political experts think he should make, and then there's Donald Trump, right? Like, he doesn't necessarily go the normal way. This is perfect for him. He's going to tease it out. He's going to say they're all solid. He's going to say they're all good. You know, if you look at some of these acceptance speeches afterwards, he lets everyone speak a little bit. It's almost like a tryout. I think he's going to pick the one that makes him look the best. That may not help him electorally the best in some of these states or fundraise the best, but if past is prologue with him, he's going to pick the one that makes him look the best. And that's kind of what you're seeing with the Elise Stefanik's, the Tim Scotts, the J.D. Vances. You know, they're more worried about propping him up, and that seems to be the route for him. And I think that's probably what he's going to decide on.
Certainly a lot of names in the mix, and we'll be looking out for who he chooses. Scott Tranter, as always, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Biden may be trailing Trump in the polls, but when it comes to cashing in on campaign funding, Biden's definitely a step ahead. The Hill staff writer Rafael Bernal is on the campaign fund trail and is breaking down the numbers.
President Biden and former President Trump are both raking in campaign funds, but Biden's war chest is almost twice as big as Trump's. Federal Election Commission filings show Biden's campaign had raised $91 million by the end of January and had $55 million available. Trump's campaign raised $85 million, but only has $30 million left. There's a simple reason why. Trump is spending much more cash. For one, Biden didn't really have a realistic primary challenge to contend with, and Trump kind of did or does. Well, anyway, Trump has mounting legal expenses that are draining his campaign resources. In 2023, Trump's political group spent $50 million on lawyers. In January, Trump's leadership PAC, Save America, spent almost $5 million in legal fees, mostly funded by his super PAC, Make America Great Again Incorporated. And this is where it gets complicated. The FEC numbers, Biden's $55 million and Trump's $33 million, they only account for their campaigns. If you add the Democratic National Committee and other associated campaigns committees, Biden has closer to $130 million available. And Trump can't raise money with the Republican National Committee until he wins the nomination, so there's no apples to apples comparison there. Trump's main fundraising arm, the Trump Save America Joint Fundraising Committee, won't report its income to the FEC until April. But we do know Trump Save America raked in $75 million in the second half of 2023 and spent $77 million, ending the year with about $3.6 million in cash. Oh, and did I mention that both campaigns are raising less money than they did 4 years ago? So comparing just campaign cash, if you add Trump and Biden's cash on hand, you get about $85 million bucks. At this point in 2020, Trump alone had upwards of $92 million on hand. Why is that? Well, neither candidate is very popular, and many Americans are just getting tired of donating money to politicians. Political groups are also funneling much more money through super PACs and other fundraising committees. And in Trump's case, he might not have a real primary challenge, but Nikki Haley is raising a lot of money that could have gone to Trump. In January alone, she racked up $16.5 million.
That's it for What's America Thinking. Come back next week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And we want to hear from you. Leave your comments and let us know what's on your mind.